When Bugatti told Matt Armstrong they wouldn't supply replacement parts for his crashed Chiron, the manufacturer effectively declared the car unrepairable through official channels, which meant a £3 million automobile sat in pieces with no path forward except the one Bob created in 72 hours using Honda Civic parts and a machine shop in England. Bob isn't a Bugatti-certified technician, has no manufacturer endorsement, owns no credentials that would suggest he's qualified to rebuild components for a hypercar, and that's exactly why what happened next represents one of the most impressive acts of independent automotive engineering ever captured on camera during a vehicle restoration project. The Bugatti Chiron runs 10 radiators to manage the thermal output of 1,500 horsepower, and several of those heat exchangers were destroyed in the crash that totaled this particular car. 2 radiators sit at the front handling engine coolant. 2 more on each side manage the same cooling circuit. 2 charge coolers regulate air temperature from the turbochargers, and the remainder handle transmission fluid, overflow, and supplementary cooling systems. Every single radiator in that network matters because the W16 engine generates enough heat at full throttle to melt itself without proper thermal management, which means losing even one component compromises the entire vehicle. Bugatti refused to supply replacements and told Matt the parts were unavailable to independent owners, leaving no supply chain and no alternative through authorized dealers. Bob examined the crashed radiators and decided he'd build new ones from scratch, which started a 3-day process that most people assumed was impossible. The damaged originals couldn't be repaired, but they still contained the information Bob needed if he knew how to read them, and reading damaged components as specification sheets is exactly the kind of skill that separates someone who follows procedures from someone who solves engineering problems. Tube pitch came from measuring what remained of the original cores. Fin density was read from sections that hadn't been crushed in the impact. Tank dimensions were calculated from the undamaged ends, and hose connection positions were taken from the fittings that were still intact. Every measurement mattered because radiator performance depends on dimensions most people never think about. Tube spacing between coolant channels determines flow rate and pressure drop through the system, which means too tight restricts flow while too wide reduces heat transfer surface area. Fin density affects cooling efficiency at different speeds, where too few fins provide inadequate surface area and too many restrict airflow when the car isn't moving fast. Tank volume has to match the cooling circuit capacity, mounting brackets must locate correctly in the chassis structure, and hose connections need to angle properly for routing through the engine bay. Bugatti designed these radiators specifically for the Chiron with specifications locked in their engineering database, not shared with independent repair shops, not available to anyone outside the factory system. Bob went to a radiator core supplier who stocks standard components across a wide range of specifications, and the cores that matched the Chiron's dimensional requirements were Honda Civic radiator cores. The physics of heat transfer doesn't care whose name appears on the bonnet, which meant a core with the right tube pitch and fin density performs the same function regardless of which manufacturer's catalog lists it. Honda and Bugatti share no manufacturing relationship. The match was purely dimensional, purely functional, purely about what the engineering actually required rather than what the brand name suggested. The Honda cores arrived as bare heat exchangers with no fittings, no brackets, no mounting points, which meant Bob had to manufacture everything else in his machine shop. Hose connection fittings were machined from aluminum to the correct diameter and positioned at the correct angle for hose routing in the Chiron's front structure. Mounting brackets were fabricated to locate each radiator with proper clearance to surrounding bodywork, and fan mounting points were positioned to accept the cooling fans that had survived the crash undamaged. Every fitting was custom work. Every bracket was made from measurements taken off the damaged originals and the car itself. Every dimension had to be right because there's no adjustment range when you're bolting components into a hypercar chassis. Assembly and checking came next, where Bob welded the manufactured fittings to the cores, attached the brackets, and verified geometry against his reference measurements. Most fabrication attempts reveal an error at this stage, where a bracket doesn't quite line up or a hose connection sits at the wrong angle. But Bob's work was accurate except for one bracket that ended up on the wrong side of one radiator. The mistake happened at 3 in the morning on the final day when logical positioning meant the bracket went on the side facing Bob rather than the side it needed to occupy in the car, and Matt's reaction when he discovered this was delivered with the particular mix of affection and exasperation that only comes from working with someone genuinely exceptional. The bracket was wrong, but the radiator was otherwise perfect, which Matt noted meant at least Bob hadn't built the entire component backwards. Installation started with the large center radiator for the primary W16 coolant circuit, which slid between the chassis legs and bolted to the upper mounts while the hoses connected and the overflow pipe routed correctly. Matt described the fit as everything lining up good, which meant Bob's measurements from damaged components had translated into functional assemblies. The side radiators went in next, the ones Bob had fabricated from scratch with no original reference on that side of the car, and they fitted just as cleanly with hoses connecting and brackets aligning. Then came the pressure test, which determines whether 72 hours of fabrication work was sufficient or whether the entire effort failed. Air was introduced through the expansion tank and pressure rose to the test value, and then everyone listened for silence or sound. Silence means every weld holds, every fitting seals, every connection between Bob's fabricated components and the Chiron's existing cooling circuit maintains pressure without leaking. They heard sound instead, a small leak in one radiator at a point that appeared damaged from transit rather than from fabrication, which meant the component had caught something during transport to the car. The leak wasn't a weld failure or a fitting that hadn't sealed properly, just a physical knock that opened a small breach in the finished assembly. Matt's immediate reaction was recognizing how close they'd come, and then immediately his next words were about what happens next, which was Bob welds the leak and the coolant goes in during the next video. That response, the instant forward movement from a setback that would stop most people, captures the entire rebuild compressed into one moment. No despair, no questioning whether the approach was correct, just a plan for fixing the problem and moving toward the temperature test that this whole project has been building toward. The comparison worth making is what Bugatti would have done differently, because the question isn't just what Bob accomplished, but what the alternative looked like through official channels. Bugatti's process for replacing Chiron radiators isn't publicly documented. No lead times are published, no availability windows are disclosed, and what's known is that Bugatti doesn't supply components to independent owners. Every part moves through authorized dealers with lead times controlled by the manufacturer and pricing that reflects the absence of competition, which meant Mark McCann waited a month just to not receive a callback about a gearbox. The radiators represent 10 separate assemblies with several destroyed in the crash, and going through official channels would have meant months of waiting with complete dependence on a supply chain that had already refused to cooperate. Bob was given damaged originals and access to a machine shop, and 3 days later he had functional replacements. Honda Civic cores perform identical heat transfer to whatever Bugatti would have supplied. Custom fittings connect them to the Chiron's cooling circuit exactly as needed. Brackets locate them correctly in the vehicle structure, and one small leak is already being addressed. That's the difference between a manufacturer controlling access and a craftsman solving problems, between a system designed to maintain dependence and an approach focused on what the engineering actually requires. The radiators Bob built will cool the W16 engine because they're already installed in the car and they've already been tested. 3 days to read specifications from damaged components, source matching cores from a Honda parts catalog, machine custom fittings in a shop, fabricate mounting brackets from aluminum, assemble complete radiator units, and fit them to a 3 million pound Bugatti Chiron. One bracket ended up on the wrong side and Bob corrected it. One radiator developed a small leak from transit damage and Bob is welding it. And Bugatti's response to Matt's request for replacement parts was silence while Bob's response was done. The invoice for that work, whatever Matt is paying, is the only fair price in this entire story because Bob delivered parts the manufacturer refused to supply, and the coolant is ready, and the temperature test this entire rebuild has been building toward is finally within reach.